Hello and welcome, I'm Joe. Now, before we start with this timeline of Tolkien's writing video, do remember to subscribe if you haven't already. The timeline is one reserved only for the writings of Tolkien related to his Middle-earth legendarium. So do bear in mind there's a lot that's up for debate, but generally we do have ascertained, we do know the general timeline of events of when he started writing, and yeah, so this is mostly going to follow that. Now, he began around 1914 in September on the 24th, thereabouts, with the Voyage of Earendel, the Evening Star. From there, in autumn, he began writing the story of Kalervo, which he would later revise into The Children of Húrin, I believe. Now, in November, on the 27th thereabout, he began revising a poem that would later be called The Horns of Ylmir, or Ulmo. April of 1915, Tolkien got to work on The Cottage of Lost play, and we have to bear in mind that at this time he was given a commission in the Lancashire Fusiliers and would train in Bedford and Staffordshire. Now, in 1915, September 12, thereabouts, he began composing a song of Ariador while stationed, as stated, in Staffordshire. Around September, late September possibly, on the 25th or 26th, there was a final meeting of all four main members of the TCBS in Lichfield. And then around November 8th, possibly, Tolkien started writing the poem Criterion Among the Trees. And then he departed on June 6th of 1916 for France and started composing the Lonely Isle poem. And at the Battle of the Somme on July 1st of 1916, his close friend Robert Gilson died. And then a couple of months later, on December the 3rd, Geoffrey Smith, also a member of the TCBS, died from wounds received 4 days earlier. So this goes a long way to impacting Tolkien's writing. That's why I mention it. So it does play a role in the timeline of events of his writing. Sometime around January or February of 1917, Tolkien begins work on the Book of Lost Tales during his time in Great Haywood. Around spring of 1917, The Fall of Gondolin is probably written, probably before June. Sometime in 1917, some theorize earlier, some later, Tolkien begins work on the Tale of Húrin. The Tale of the Children of Húrin. Sorry for that slight slip up there. We want to get this right. Now, in November of 1918, Tolkien would return to Oxford, and it's at this time that he probably begins working on his first version of the Music of the Ainur. And, well, this leads to him writing a great many other tales in 1919. Around this time, he writes of the chaining of Melko, the coming of the elves, and the making of Kor, and the theft of Melko and the darkening of Valinor. Very important stories in the Legendarium, and for all fans of the Silmarillion. On March 10th, 1920, Tolkien would read a shortened version of The Fall of Gondolin to the Exeter College Essay Club, having completed this first edition of The Fall of Gondolin. And then he would, when he moved to Leeds, begin working on an alliterative poetic version of The Children of Húrin. The last part took place around March of 1921. Now, after this, he began working around early 1925 on an alliterative poem of The Flight of the Noldor from Valinor. Around March and April of 1928, Tolkien did work on Cantos 4 through 9 of the Lay of Lathian, which in the next year, in December, C.S. Lewis would read and critique. In the autumn of 1930, Tolkien continued working on the Lay of Lathian, notably Cantos 10 to 13, and he also ended up working on the Quenta Noldorinawa, that may have been written at this time. It's kind of uncertain. But then in the next year, he would try to continue his work on the Lay of Lathian, only to abandon it, which is a shame, because it is a great poem. In the middle of 1930, we finally get Tolkien writing down the fateful sentence from The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. In possibly 1932, Tolkien would lend a typescript copy of The Hobbit to C.S. Lewis, a copy that ended with the death of Smaug, and Lewis obviously critiqued it. And on the 15th of February, thereabouts, 1934, it was definitely February 15th, 1934, the poem of The Adventures of Tom Bombadil were published in the Oxford Magazine. Early in 1936, Suzanne Dagnall would read to Alan Unwin the unfinished manuscript of The Hobbit and would urge Tolkien to finish the book, which he would. And on the 21st of September, 1937, The Hobbit would be published. And because of its success, Stanley Unwin would urge Tolkien to write a sequel, which he then began. This sequel would later go on to be The Lord of the Rings. From the 15th of November to the 19th of December in 1937, Tolkien would resume work on the Quenta Silmarillion, but would then abandon this in favor of working on his new Hobbit book. In late August of 1938, Tolkien would reach the 7th chapter of The Lord of the Rings. The hobbits end up arriving at the Prancing Pony. And around the 1st to 15th of September, thereabouts, in the same year, he would continue writing and reach all the way up to Rivendell, only from the 15th of September to about October of that year, he would rewrite a great deal of the earlier parts of the narrative and go on to alter the names of the hobbits. In the middle of 1942, Tolkien would reach what becomes Helm's Deep, The Road to Isengard, Flotsam and Jetsam, The Voice of Saruman, and The Palantir. Now, unfortunately, in 1943, he would end up so busy with university duties and work as an air raid warden, plus other distractions, and would not be able to continue working on The Lord of the Rings. Only to resume work in 1944, around April, and would write for a great chunk of that month, and May, a great deal of the early parts of later chapters, such as The Passage of the Marshes, The Black Gate is Closed, Of Herbs and Stewed Rabbit, The Window on the West, The Forbidden Pool, Journey to the Crossroads, The Stairs of Cirith Ungol, Shelob's Lair, and The Choices of Master Samwise, before moving to a different project. It seems, regarding the drowning of Anandune to his son Christopher. Now, for a great deal of autumn of 1946, he would continue working on such chapters of Lord of the Rings as Minas Tirith, The Passing of the Grey Company, The Muster of Rohan, The Siege of Gondor, The Battle of the Pelennor Fields, The Pyre of Denethor, The Houses of Healing, The Last Debate, and The Black Gate Opens. Wouldn't be until 1948 when Tolkien would draft the chapters The Land of Shadow, Mount Doom, The Field of Cormellan, The Steward and the King, Many Partings, Homeward Bound, The Scouring of the Shire, which is one of my favorites, and The Grey Havens. In the autumn of 1948, Tolkien would write a new version of The Downfall of Numenor. Cue the trumpets as around from February to October of 1949, Tolkien would type up the Lord of the Rings and make a lot of corrections as he works, but this was a big deal. Circa autumn, though, of that same year, he would begin negotiations to try and get the Lord of the Rings published. In the winter of 1949, Tolkien would resume work on the Lay of Lothian, before going on to work on other projects towards early 1950, notably of Valinor and the Two Trees, of the Coming of the Elves, and of Men and Dwarves. He'd also end up quarreling a little with his publishers over his desire to publish both Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion almost as a package deal. This fell through. And in August of 1950, he worked on the appendixes, only to then, around the summer of 1951, continue working on some of his other parts of his legendarium, such as the Annals of Amun. He'd rework the Grey Annals. No, he began working on writing the Grey Annals. Sorry. I misread my notes there. He would write a 12-page manuscript, which is later named Of Maeglin, before quarreling in late 1951 with Waldman over how Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings are indivisible and interconnected. Needless to say, he didn't really win that fight too well. He also began work on a prose version of the later part of Narn Ichin Hurin, the return of Turin to his death. In 1952, around April, Collins, the publisher, would decline to publish The Lord of the Rings. And in August of that same year, Tolkien made some recordings of the Gollum chapter in The Hobbit and some poems from The Lord of the Rings. And he would polish up the text in September of that same year of, Irandel was a mariner, and the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, before at last getting confirmation that, yes, Allen and Unwin would publish The Lord of the Rings on a profit-sharing basis. The early part of 1954 was taken up with Tolkien had to correct certain details in Lord of the Rings. He worked on his appendix as an index throughout the second half of the year, only for The Fellowship of the Ring to be published on July 29th, 1954, and in November, on the 11th of that same year, The Two Towers were published. And in January of 1955, Tolkien reworked Tal Elmar, in between more work on the appendixes, only to, on October the 20th, publish The Return of the King. The next major writing phase for Tolkien was in 1959 with, reworking and adding to the Silmarillion. And this went on up to March of 1960. Last, though, tragedy was to strike Tolkien in 1963 on November the 22nd, when his great friend, the proofreader, and it seems almost editor of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and one of the main contributing forces towards encouraging Tolkien to get published and to expand his legendarium, the great C.S. Lewis, died. In August of 1965, Tolkien would expand The Heirs of Elendil for Appendix A of Lord of the Rings, with October 27th, 1966, seeing the second edition of The Lord of the Rings being published. He in late February to March in 1967, worked on some corrections for the first one-volume paperback edition of his great epic, and would write about the Palantiri. He would try in 1968, on January 8th, to work on a final typescript of the New Shadow, only to give up the New Shadow, as it didn't pique his interest for very long. Early in 1970, he made some changes to the story of Megalyn. The next big event in his life was on November 29th of 1971, when his beloved wife of several decades, probably I think more than 50 years by then, died. Edith Tolkien remained a great inspiration and contributing force to Middle-earth. So her passing had a great impact on Tolkien. In November or December of 1972, Tolkien likely wrote what was later published as Glorfindel and Círdan, and in August of 1973, he would write about Galadriel and Celeborn, and this was his final addition to his Legendarium. And this was, well, because the professor, the great J.R.R. Tolkien, sadly, died on September 2nd, 1973. All future works in the Legendarium, in the, any publication of his work, of his poems, of his writings, would all be done by his son, Christopher, who, as Tolkien's heir, would go on to publish in 1977, on the 15th of September, the first edition of the Silmarillion. On October 2nd of 1980, he published the Unfinished Tales of Numenor. On August 21st of 1981, with the aid of Humphrey Carpenter, he would publish the Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. In 1982, saw the publication of The Road to Middle-earth by Tom Shippey, that beloved Tolkien supporter, and, well, just simply the greatest assistant Christopher ever had for completing his father's work. The 80s and 90s, though, saw the publication of the Lost Tales, part 1 being in 1983, October 27th, part 2, 1984, August 16th. On the 22nd of August, 1985, saw the publication of Volume 3 in the History of Middle-earth series. August 21st of 1986 was Volume 4 of the History of Middle-earth. The 27th of August, 1987 was Volume 5. 88, so on August 25th, saw Volume 6 published. September 7th, 1989 was Volume 7. 1990, on the 23rd of August, was the publication of The War of the Ring, Volume 8 in the History of Middle-earth series. 1992, January 6th, saw the publication of Volume 9. 93, on September 23rd, was Volume 10 with the Morgoth's Ring. I really love that part. 1994, on October 20th, saw the publication of Volume 11, with 95's on the 27th of October, there was publication of J.R.R. Tolkien, Artist and Illustrator, by Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull. And 1996, on the 2nd of September, saw the publication of the 12th volume in the History of Middle-earth series. Now, 2007, on April 16th, saw the publication of one of my favorite fantasy novels, and easily my favorite dark fantasy novel, published and edited by Christopher Tolkien, The Children of Húrin. With this being the first of the three great stories or epics of the first age of Middle-earth to be published. The other two took several more years before they were published. May 4th, 2017, saw the publication of Beren and Luthien, also edited by Christopher Tolkien. With this story probably being the greatest fantasy love story of all times, with the published literary edition including part, I believe, the entirety of the Lay of Lathian. I'm pretty sure it's the whole thing. I'd have to crack it open to take a look. So bear with me here as I complete the video. And at a later date, I'll comment on that, probably when we do the book club for Beren and Luthien. August 30th of 2018 saw the publication of The Fall of Gondolin, the great hidden white city of Middle-earth. Well, first age of Middle-earth, with this epic being very well received, obviously, and edited by Christopher, who sadly would fall in 2020 on January 16th to the utter horror and great sorrow of the fantasy community and any Tolkien fan. Now, if you like this video and my summary of the timeline of the writings and publication of Tolkien's works plural, do leave a like. Tell me what you think. Heck, if you know more than I do and I made a mistake somewhere along the way, feel free to correct me. I'll welcome it. And also, do subscribe and share the video, as we're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers so we could then go on to publish for your entertainment the first chapter of a dark fantasy horror novel we've been working on for some time. So, once again, we would be greatly in your debt if you were to subscribe to the channel.